Introduction to Active Directory. In this nugget, we'll be introducing Active Directory, where we'll start off with a discussion of what Active Directory really is and what some of the advantages are of it. We'll also talk about domain structure, which is especially useful if you've heard some terms thrown around but you're not really quite sure what they mean. For example, what's a domain? What's a forest? What's a tree? A domain tree? All of those kinds of things are useful to know about, as well as sites. Now, of course, also as you start in any video series like this nugget we're talking about here, then we'll talk about many topics which will be elaborated on further on in our series, so keep that in mind. And then we'll also talk about installing the forest root. We'll not only talk about it, but we'll actually do it. We'll install the first domain in our forest, known as the forest root. Alright, as we get started taking a look at this thing called Active Directory, it sounds really cool. It sounds like, some kind of a really slick directory of some type, and I guess it kind of is, but it really is just Microsoft's marketing term, more or less, for directory services. Now, directory services is not new with Microsoft, and it's not original with Microsoft. There were standards that already existed out there called the X.500, and then that's a really big standard, and then there was also the Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, or LDAP, which was kind of a whittled down version of the X500 because it was just a little bit unwieldy in its original format. Well, Microsoft has borrowed from that, and they're not the first ones to use these kinds of directories. Banyan Vines years ago used a directory service similar to this. Novell has used directories similar to this, and now Microsoft has, of course, Active Directory. And so let's explore a little bit about what this is. First of all, the core of it in Microsoft world is the ntds.dit file. There are other files that support that file, but that's the core of where everything's actually stored. Now, this is not a file you double-click on and browse through and edit, by hand and stuff like that. This is a file that you use other tools normally to adjust, and we'll look at some of those tools as we go along. But at the core, again, that's really what it is. Now then, here I switched over to a nuggetlab.com diagram, which gives you a little bit more exposure to what Active Directory is and the kinds of things that are contained therein. What we have here is a number of different things that we don't really have to memorize. I mean, some of these things are just there for informational purposes, but also to expose a little bit about what Active Directory is. So what are the kind of objects that might be in here? Well, there's this users container, for example. And I want to point out also that these containers that we're looking at look like folders that you would double-click on in the file system. Well, that's not how this works. We use other Active Directory tools to expose these various components, probably most likely and most often Active Directory users and computers. But we'll come back to that. So there's a default container here called users. There's some default user accounts that are going to be there every time you create a domain or install a domain controller. And there's also something called the configuration naming context, and it stores some other things. For example, services that are related to Active Directory. These are things that will point out various components of Active Directory that users or computers can be able to access. Now, most of that really takes place behind the scenes. Even though a user account might need access to these services, the user actually sitting at the keyboard doesn't see a lot of that going on. And then there's also sites. Sites will relate to various locations, and sites are going to be the logical representation, very often, of our physical topology. We'll address this in more detail later on, but the first one is just called default first site name. Now, normally we'd rename that to, the New York site or the Phoenix site or something like that, but that's what you get started with, and then there are the servers that are contained within that site. So if I renamed this to, the New York site, for example, then there might be 5, 6, 10 servers that are located in that one site. And the reason why we put things in different sites, as we'll see later on, is to isolate service so that we don't have to do a lot of things across a WAN link. And then there's a very important item right down here. This is called the schema. The schema is going to be able to keep track of and identify the various components of Active Directory. So it's what gives us the ability to create objects. It's kind of the skeleton on which all of Active Directory is built. Then there's a built-in container here, which has some default accounts that used to be local at the time that the computer was converted to a domain controller. And then we'll also have some computer accounts. Your computers also have a username and a logon, and we don't really have to be concerned with that in most cases, but in fact, they do have a username and a password that they use to log on with. Then once we have a domain controller, it'll go inside of this domain controller's OU. Notice how this kind of folder-looking thing here has a slightly different look than the rest of these, in that this one has like a book on it or a folder-looking kind of a thing on there. in Active Directory diagrams, and in fact also in Active Directory users and computers, you will see this kind of a container identified as an organizational unit. That's more detail than we need right now, but later on we'll be working quite a lot with organizational units. One of the advantages of an OU, as they're called, is that we can do things such as apply group policy to them, which is another thing we'll cover a little bit later on. But that's how we can kind of control everything that goes on in our environment. And then we have some things in the system item right here, and then we'll have like Microsoft's DNS. We'll see later on that Active Directory's DNS can be fully integrated into Active Directory, and therefore it makes it easier to manage. And since the DNS will then be part of Active Directory here, very, very simple in that respect. And then there's policies. I mentioned earlier we'll have group policy objects, for example. That's also going to be part of our system context. We also have user accounts, and again, this is just going to be a container, but we'll have the default administrator account, the domain administrator account, for example, and the domain admins, and a bunch of others. I just put a couple of examples in there. And by the way, you might look at this and say, what does this CN equals mean right here at the beginning of this? Well, that's part of the L to specifically identify, then it would be CN equals administrator, and then it would have to follow the path all the way up to the end of the domain. And it would be CN equals administrator, comma, CN equals users, because that would identify the container it's in, comma, CN equals nugget lab, comma, CN equals com. Okay, so that's kind of how that would look. We don't need to be too concerned with that right now, but that's just why we have a CN on there. So this kind of gives us the overall view, the 30,000-foot view of what Active Directory is and the kinds of things that will be in it. The things that we'll probably be working with most often are not actually even in this diagram because we haven't created any in a default installation other than the domain controllers one, but that would be our organizational units, or OUs. And that's probably where the majority of your users will go, the majority of your computers and groups will also go into an OU. And then here I have a diagram that identifies this a little bit more specifically as far as OUs are concerned. So here again we have nuggetlab.com, and I got kind of lazy. Sometimes I just abbreviate nlab.com, and you'll see this in other places as well, especially if I'm crammed for space and nuggetlab's kind of long. So here's nuggetlab.com once again, and now I've got organizational units. Notice that these can be distributed and broken up according to a number of different logical purposes. In this case, we're breaking them up according to where they're physically located. Maybe I have users in Phoenix, and I also have users in Tucson. Okay, and then within Phoenix, I have Phoenix users and Phoenix computers. And you might ask yourself, why not just put all the Phoenix users and all the Phoenix computers into just the Phoenix OU, and then you can simplify your structure, not have to have these two bottom ones. Well, that certainly could be done, especially in a smaller environment. But you'll find out that for practical administrative purposes, it gets much easier to administer these if you can count on there being only users in a user's OU and only computers in a computer's OU. And then later on you could even divide that up further so that the Phoenix computers might have other sub-OUs underneath them, or child OUs, where one of the computer's containers there would be server OU, and maybe you'd have another one for laptop OUs and desktop OUs. So you can branch that out further down and further down and further on down. Maybe there's my laptops, maybe here's my desktops, and maybe I had another one for servers and so forth. So certainly those things are also a possibility, but that's what very often you'll see in terms of an OU structure. Now let me kind of mark this up a little bit and give you another perspective on how this could also go. Instead of having geographic distributions over here, I can also divide this up according to something like departments. Maybe this would be accounting. Maybe this would be sales. Okay, and then you can have my sales users and my sales computers here as well. So maybe both of these would be sales, and you get the idea there. You can just divide that up a number of different ways. Now for our current exam purposes for the 70-640, we don't need to be too concerned about the logical infrastructure of the OU. That's for a design exam that you'll probably also be taking if you're looking to get your Microsoft certifications. But for the time being, just understand that organizational units are discrete units that are designed to make administering Active Directory easier for the administrators. The users don't even know what OU they're in most cases, and they don't even care. And that's fine. Most of the time, OUs are for my own purposes so that I can keep my brain straight, and also so that I can apply group policy objects to those OUs. And there's a certain hierarchy and flow for GPOs within organizational unit and domain structure. And we'll also get to the GPOs at a later point, and that's a big emphasis also on this exam. I feel like I keep saying we'll get to that later. I promise to you I'm not procrastinating. It's just that this is an early nugget in this series, and so naturally we're going to run across a lot of different topics that we don't cover all in the same first video. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at something else. Alright, then now let's come back here and just continue our discussion of what Active Directory is. We already discussed that it's an ntds.dit file, and we started to look a little bit about the hierarchy of it, organizational units, and so forth. But before I move on too much, let's talk also about some of the advantages of Active Directory. Now, you're not likely to be examined on any of this in the exam, but it's useful for career purposes and for just overall knowledge to be aware of the fact that Active Directory is centralized. This is a very cool thing that gives you the ability to centrally administer your environment rather than having to hopscotch around and touch a bunch of different servers and administer them all separately. And you'll still have to do that to some degree, but at least as far as Active Directory goes, it is a centralized thing. And let me give you some examples of that. Here, for example, maybe if we go back way far back, this is like 1996, where we had NT4, we had maybe an NT4 domain controller. And then we also had a number of different other things that we might have to administer as IT staff. So you might have a Unix server over here that served up your files. You might have some other kind of a mail server over here for email. Then you might have a remote access server for dial-in accounts or VPN connections and things like this. Then you'd have a database server over here, maybe an Oracle database, for example. And then you'd have Novell Directory Services, which is kind of really a predecessor, or I guess they were the first ones really, major ones, to have a directory service ahead of Microsoft anyway. So Novell really is the one that came out with a big, strong infrastructure with that. Now the problem here is, if I have a user account here in NT4, and the user account logs onto their workstation, okay, now they need to access some files on the Unix server. Well, they had a username over here when they logged on to my NT4 domain controller. Okay, so they had a username and they had a password. Okay, and that was great. But now when they need to access these Unix files, maybe it has a different username and a password. So now they have to enter in a separate username and pass. So I'll just put U and P for username and password here. And then they say, oops, you know what, I got to check my email. So now they have a separate username and password over here. And there's no real way to synchronize, or no easy way to synchronize all these username and passwords around. Same with their RAS server. If they got their laptop on the road and they dial in, then maybe the RAS server, again, yet another username and a password. Now, it is possible to synchronize these two a little bit closer with RAS servers, but you get the idea here. It could be, in worst case scenario, a number of different usernames and passwords all around. And then to make matters worse, I might decide to just, as a user, that I'm just going to set my username and password to be the same on all of these. But what if my Unix server has a password expiration of, 14 days? But my mail server has a password expiration of 30 days. The RAS server, maybe it syncs up with this NT4 domain controller, and maybe these both have, 42 days expiration. And then the NDS server, maybe it was 30 days, and you see where this is going. Maybe this one is, 12 days. So now when I am prompted to change my password because I got to access these files over on the Unix server, now I might just have to change the same password on all these other ones. So you see it has kind of a cascading effect. And it's very difficult for users to keep track of this whole scenario and keep track of all their passwords. That's when you get things like passwords written on Post-it notes or hidden under keyboards or all those types of things. So it's not a centralized environment. It's confusing for the users. It's a lot of overhead for administrators because we have to reset everybody's passwords every time they forget what it was over on the NDS server or the database server or wherever else it was. So it's a little bit complicated. Now here, if I scratch all of that and start over again, maybe I upgraded everything to Active Directory Domain Services, and this would be like Windows Server 2008 domain controllers. I'll just put W2K8. That's how I normally abbreviate Windows Server 2008, by the way. So W2K8 servers here and here. Now, part of the centralization with this is that when I put a user account up here, or make any change to a user account, such as changing their password, on this domain controller, it replicates to this domain controller in the same site almost immediately. So it's very, very quick in terms of updating its other, what we call peer domain controllers. They're called peer domain controllers because they both have equal authority to make changes to the Active Directory database. So I might have an administrator here that made a change to this user account. Maybe they reset their password or something. By the same token, an administrator down here could also reset maybe another user's password or even the same user's password over here. And so these both have equal levels of authority. Any changes that are made are easily synchronized between the two of them. And then that's where our centralization is. And then what we'll also have is the ability to work in a much smoother fashion throughout the rest of our network if we use an all Microsoft solution, that is. And boy, wouldn't Microsoft like that. Maybe here I've got a Windows Server 2008 file server. Well, now the user account that I used here, my user and my password, are going to be forwarded over here to this file server through a Kerberos getting ticket service. Okay, there's a Kerberos service that's used in Active Directory. We don't really explore that in this particular exam, but the essential idea of it is that when I log on to my domain controller, and I can be sitting at this workstation, but when I log on using my user account and my username and password, a ticket is granted to me. Okay, I'll just put T for ticket here. And this ticket can then be passed around the network, and I can pass it on to this file server. And the file server is able to look at the ticket, and they're almost impossible to forge or to duplicate. So it'll look at it and say, I can tell that you got that from somebody I trust, which is my domain controller. So therefore, since you've got this ticket, we're going to let you go on ahead and access the files that are on my file server. I don't have to log on again to this file server using a separate username and a password. The same kind of ticket service can be used to access my Exchange server for email, to dial in when I'm on the road using a VPN, for example, or a modem dial-up connection using routing and remote access. Microsoft SQL Server 2007, I can use the same user accounts, groups, and so forth that I have on directory services to gain authority and access to my SQL database. So you see how much easier that is. The user logs on once, they have access throughout the entire domain and all of the member servers and any other resources we have, including other things that aren't even on here, such as print servers, for example. So pretty full access, and it's very, very centralized. Now then, quickly as I go through the rest of these, it's also scalable. Active Directory, you can use that to create millions and millions of objects. In fact, some friends of mine and I, we did a thing where we created some scripts that would just create user accounts day and night. And this went on for days. As fast as the processor and the hard drive could handle it, it would create accounts. And there were millions of accounts that we'd created. And Active Directory never gave up. It just kept on working. The only thing that was a problem was we eventually ran out of hard disk space, and so we couldn't create anymore. But anyway, it's scalable in terms of the size of it. You can put millions and millions of objects in it, whereas in old days, like NT4 days, you can only create 40,000 objects, and that wasn't too good. And there are a lot of organizations out there right now that are well into six figures for the number of objects they have. It's also extensible. Now, we don't really do with this too much, but Active Directory gives me the ability to edit the schema. Remember, we talked about that a little bit earlier. That's kind of the skeleton of Active Directory, off of which everything else hangs. And then I can add additional properties to the schema or manage it in different ways. So I can extend onto it. There's, for example, white papers that Microsoft had years ago, because Active Directory's been out since Windows 2000. Where you could do something like add the social security number to a user's account, which is not there by default. There's certainly the possibility also to add maybe a GIF file or a little photograph of each user and integrate that into maybe an employee badge making program that's been created, so that that's all integrated into that. So it's extensible to give you that capability. Don't know that all organizations use the full capability of the extensibility, but at least it's there. And then it's also manageable. We have a lot of tools, whether it's the command line or PowerShell, or most frequently, for purposes of this course, Active Directory users and computers, to manage our users groups, all those types of things, computer accounts. And we can use the Group Policy Management Console to manage our group policy objects. So there's all kinds of tools that we can use, and it's very easy to manage in that respect. And then it's also pretty secure. Remember I was talking to you about the tickets earlier. And this is something called Kerberos. That's the whole technology that's used there. Kerberos is very, very secure, very difficult to crack Kerberos tickets or to impersonate them or anything like that, as I mentioned earlier. And then also a lot of the traffic that goes on from one computer to the next is also encrypted automatically in an Active Directory environment and very difficult to impersonate. So the security is good. And then DNS integration. It used to be that we'd have to have some kind of a directory service for our user accounts and our computers and all of that. And then we also needed to access resources on our networks. And we'd have a DNS server for that. Well, in the old days, somebody probably had to sit at that DNS server and just create accounts. In fact, I knew someone in Houston. He was one of 2 people who did nothing all day other than to manage those DNS accounts. Well, now there's largely something called dynamic updates where you can use that in DNS integration to make that a lot easier. And as far as getting the records that are in DNS to other servers, if it's integrated into Active Directory, which is certainly the recommended way to do that, then it automatically replicates to all my other domain controllers that are also DNS integrated. And it makes it very, very simple. We don't have to worry about secondaries and our replication infrastructure and all of that. Now, we will be talking a lot more about DNS integration and replicating our zones to other locations as we go, or zone transfers is what that's called. So we'll also talk about replication as well. This is where we'll take remember I created a user account, or talked about creating a user account on one Active Directory domain services server, or a domain controller, as they're more often called. And that user account can then get replicated within moments to another domain controller in my same site. And then we can also talk about replication between sites. I might have a WAN link that separates a New York office and a Phoenix office. Well, with replication, I have to be concerned about how often that updates, when that replication takes place. Things like this. I want to make sure that I have a consistent picture of Active Directory, and so that it's the same all the way around wherever I have an office. Okay, and this is when we call convergence, is when Active Directory agrees with itself in all of its different locations. Well, the replication engine is very, very good to keep Active Directory consistent. And then probably one of the most powerful features of Active Directory is Group Policy Objects, or GPOs. These are items that we can use to create, and we usually will link them to the domain or to an organizational unit, and that's the most frequent, organizational units. And then from there, we can control virtually every aspect of what the user can see and do. There's very little that's left out, and we have a great deal of control over that, as well as other things such as security measures and all of this, in a group policy object. So now let's talk a little bit about domain structure. I've got to put my line through the E there on the end, so let me do that now. The domain structure, we have 3 primary things that we can use here, and we'll get to the 4th one here as well in a minute. There's the domain, first of all. And when I install my first domain controller in the environment, it might look something like this. Let's go to it. It might look something like this. This is a diagram that I used a little bit earlier. Here's where I have a single namespace, and this one domain contains all of my accounts, all of my Active Directory, and I have no other domains. I might have multiple domain controllers, which all service nuggetlab.com, but I only have one namespace, nuggetlab.com. I don't have nuggetlab.com and east.sales.nuggetlab.com, or west.sales.nuggetlab.com, or some other namespace within this. Okay, so this is again just a single simple domain that I might have. The other thing I might have, though, is I might have the need to branch out, so to speak, into a tree. And if we do something like that, let's take a look at what it might look like. Here, for example, I've got nuggetlab.com, and again, this is just kind of the distinguished name-looking way of doing that. I could have just as easily put nuggetlab.com, but in the LDAP paths, this is the kind of lingo that we would use. And so I've got my nuggetlab.com, and then let's say that we have 2 branch offices that are pretty major. They're not just with 5 or 6 employees each. They're really large organizations, and maybe we have, for a number of different reasons, the need to create their own separate domains over there. So I have my West domain, and this would be west.nuggetlab.com, and let me just write that out so you can see how that would look. And you can see it right there, so it would be west.nuggetlab.com, and then I might have east.nuggetlab.com over here as well. And why would I have more than one domain? Well, there's a number of different reasons for that. Again, this will be for another exam where we'll talk more about architecting Active Directory. But for our current purposes, let's just get a couple of the main reasons. Number one, at least in older versions of Windows domain services, I might have had to have a separate password policy. So for example, maybe up here we had 7-character passwords. Well, here we work with confidential data and more security-sensitive information. So maybe over here in the West, we needed to have a longer password policy. Maybe needed 12 passwords. Well, clear up until now in Windows Server 2008, you would have to create separate domains for that. And this might be as a result of growth. Maybe we have started off with a Windows 2003 domain, and now we've upgraded to Windows Server 2008, but we already had this domain created down here because they needed a longer password policy. We'll see that as we work with Windows Server 2008, that it's no longer necessary to create an entire extra domain here simply for password policy. But that, again, may be just a holdover from a previous Active Directory implementation. Other reasons why you might have to go to separate domains could also be political. It might be that we have administrators down here that were always domain admins before, and they just insist on continuing to be domain admins, or maybe they have a hard time understanding Active Directory if they don't have their own domain. If that's the case, then that's just a human limitation. In reality, we could have gone to a single domain like nuggetlab.com, and we could have created an OU for West, for example, and then just delegated full control of it to all the West administrators. But that's getting ahead of myself just a little bit. And then you might have East over here, and then within it you'd have organizational units and so forth. So that's what a tree would look like, is when I have other domains that are in the same contiguous namespace. So here we started off again at nuggetlab.com. Now I've got west.nuggetlab.com, and then it would be east.nuggetlab.com. And so notice they have nuggetlab.com in common, and they all kind of, all roads lead to Rome, so to speak. They all eventually come up here to the forest root right up at the top. So the key thing to remember with the tree infrastructure here is a common namespace. Or as it's also called, a contiguous namespace. And this is, again, where I'm going to have 2 or more domains in the same forest. And let's also take a look at a forest. Now, typically we think of a forest as 2 or more domains in discontiguous namespace. So, for example, here I might start off with my normal nuggetlab.com domain, but maybe I've got, maybe I've got some child domains over here as well, and this is my tree. And then maybe we decided to spin off another business unit. And here we might have accusource.net. That's actually the name of my own domain that I'm using some of my instruction here for CBT Nuggets. But here we'd have accusource.net as some kind of a subsidiary or a spin-off or something like that. We want to be able to access resources back and forth across both domains, so when I install my first domain controller over here in accusource.net, I can tell it to join an existing forest, okay? And when we installed this first domain right here at nuggetlab.com, that also became my forest root, okay? And so even if I left with only this, if this was the only domain that I ever created and all this other stuff didn't exist, this would still be my forest root, and my forest in that case would also consist of only a single domain. But very often we think of a forest when we talk about this type of an infrastructure as being 2 or more domains in discontiguous namespace. Notice that these names don't have anything in common. Okay, it's not like our previous look where we looked at west.nuggetlab.com and east.nuggetlab.com or something like that. And when I set this domain up as joining this existing forest, but just that it's got its own separate namespace, it creates this two-way transitive trust, which means that if I have user accounts over here, and I have user accounts over here, and groups and computer accounts and all that kind of stuff, then I can grant access to resources back and forth. So for example, if this domain here has a folder that I want this user to access, I can do that. I can grant that user permission to access that particular folder, and I can see these user accounts over here and grant access to whoever I want. And because it's two-way, I might also have something over here. Maybe I've got a printer. That's supposed to be a printer. And that's supposed to be paper there that comes out with, words on it and stuff. And maybe I want this user here to print to that printer. Well, then I can just grant them access to that printer because of my two-way transitive trust that takes place in a domain. And in fact, I could even go down in these child domains. If I had resources back and forth that I wanted to share between sales.accusource.net and us.nuggetlab.com, well, certainly, once again, we could share those resources back and forth and gain access to the accounts throughout the entire forest. And now then, I also talked to you about sites just a little while ago. Let's go into a little bit more detail about that. For sites, we might have something like this. Once again, where I've got, let's go back to a single domain infrastructure where I've got nuggetlab.com. And this circle here, this oval, is usually what represents a site in Active Directory diagrams and things. This is going to represent my physical topology in Phoenix, for example, where my office right here, maybe they've got an IP subnet. Well, they will have to have an IP subnet, but they could have one or they could have multiple IP subnets, but these will all be high-speed, well-connected. So they might be, 100 megabits per second or a gigabit E or something like that. Well, gigabit E would be 1,000 megabits per second. So any computers in this network can communicate high speed with one another. This means then that my domain controllers in nuggetlab.com in this site can also replicate back and forth between one another very, very quickly and almost instantaneously. However, I might have another office down here in Tucson, and maybe it's a smaller office, and maybe we're trying to conserve money, so maybe I've only got a 256K WAN link here that we've used to connect these two offices. So now when I have Active Directory updates that take place in nuggetlab.com up here in Phoenix, then I can use my site link here. Okay, that's what that would be, a site link which determines the scheduling and some other factors in replicating data from up here to down here. And because it's a slow link and stuff, and maybe it's already heavily utilized, then maybe I would set it up to replicate only during certain times of the very early morning. But this, at least in brief, identifies the concept of sites to us. Again, a site is an area of high-speed connectivity, but it's usually separated from other sites by lesser speed connectivity. So here again, I might have gigabit E network. Here I've got a gigabit E network, but I've only got a 256K WAN link separating the two, and so even though I can communicate in high speed here and high speed here, I have to communicate slowly across here, and I have to use my site link to carefully measure that out. And even if this was a faster link, by the way, maybe it's a T1 line, which would be 1.54 megabits per second, for example. That's going to be a little bit faster, of course, but I would still normally, as a responsible administrator, measure out carefully the frequency of the replication traffic and some other factors there. But we'll discuss those in more detail as we go throughout our series. This at least gives you an idea for what the sites are. Alright, then enough about the concepts of Active Directory. Let's go ahead and install it. First of all, you may notice that this initial configuration tasks window that we see here appears when you first start up Windows Server 2008. Many administrators select this checkbox to not show the window a logon, and then they close this. If they want to get it back, by the way, once you close it, it also automatically opens up Server Manager, but if you want to get it back, then you just go down here to start search. Notice this is no longer run down here. A run is over here, but you can use this in many ways, just like you could use the run command. But I'll type OOBE, O-O-B-E, or out-of-the-box experience, and then continue. This is my user account control that I use to confirm that I want to perform an administrative action, much like Windows Vista. And then I get my initial configuration tasks back, and that's again because I typed in OOBE. Now most of the time, once again, I don't care about that, because I'll very often configure my servers using Server Manager instead. Notice that it parks me around kind of the root of this MMC console. If I go down to the bottom, it gives me the option here to go to Roles. And if I scroll up, I can also go to Roles over here and click on Add Roles. Now I could do that, and that's what I did in fact, and then next my way through a wizard here, and I could add in Active Directory Domain Services. But I think there's another thing that I'd rather do instead of doing it this way, because that adds in Active Directory Domain Services, but it does not actually make this a domain controller quite yet. So there's a little bit more of an abbreviated way to do that, and if I minimize this, I'll show you that by going to a command prompt or a start run, or again, you go to the search here, either way. Any of the ways you want to go. So these all work, and I would just type in now DC promo. This is the same command that we've used ever since Windows 2000, and when I press enter to consent to user account control, then we'll see that what's going to happen here is it's going to start the installation process. Now I've mentioned a couple of times, by the way, while I'm waiting for this, something about user account control. On my screen, I can see a user account control prompt. You probably did not see that because it conceals itself from our recording software because of the nature of the way it works. Just so you know what I'm talking about there. And that's very similar, like I said, to the Windows Vista user account control. Alright, once DC Promo has launched itself a little bit of ways, I'm just going to go ahead and minimize this to get it out of the way. Then we can see here that we can do a number of different methods for installation. Now I'll talk some more about the advanced modes a little bit later on, for example with read-only domain controllers that we might be able to use. But for the time being, we're just going to go ahead with a basic installation as I next on through this. This simply talks about some of the cryptography that's involved with this and compatibility with weaker NT4 style cryptography. You can, for the most part, skip past this, but there's a link there if you want to know more information about this. Not really an issue unless we're using NT4, which is unlikely in most scenarios. Then we can also decide whether we want to create a domain controller for an existing forest or for a new forest. Now, since this is the first domain that I'm creating, it's going to be the forest root, which means there is no forest yet. And so I need to create a new domain in a new forest. Okay? Otherwise, I could choose existing forest and add a domain controller to an existing domain, or create a new domain in an existing forest. And those pretty well explain themselves. If you want a little bit of a review about forests and things and how you can have those created, then go back to our previous instruction on that here in this particular nugget. Then as I click on Next, I want to enter in the fully qualified domain name of the new forest root domain. So what's this going to be called? Well, normally we use NuggetLab, lab.com, and it's not case sensitive, by the way. I could type it in any way I wanted to, and then I'll click on Next. And then what it's going to do, of course, is to see if the forest name is already in use. This is simply a failsafe, because if you accidentally created two forests of the same name, you'd have some serious problems on the network. So we want to make sure that that's not going to be an issue for us. And then we come across our forest functional level. We'll talk a lot more about forest functional level as well as the next page, which will be domain functional level in a little while. But for the time being, just understand that the further down we go, in other words, the further we get towards Windows Server 2008, the more features we turned on. Because Windows 2000 had some problems and some Active Directory properties that didn't give us all the flexibility that we got later on in Windows Server 2000. And then in Windows Server 2008, we might get even more features. Now, in reality, as far as the forest functional level itself is concerned, there's really no practical difference between 2003 and 2008. The advantage to going with Windows Server 2008 forest functional level, or FFL as I usually call it, is that it will then cause any domains that are promoted inside of the forest to become Windows Server 2008 domain functional level. Okay. But I'm just going to leave it at 2003 for now so that you can see a little bit later on about how to promote that after the fact if you want to, or how to raise that level. And it gives you a little bit more information in the dialog box there, as you can see as well. And then the domain functional level, again, the higher I make that, the more features I'll turn on in Active Directory. There are additional features for Windows Server 2008 domain functional level. I'm going to leave it at 2003 because, once again, I'll show you at a later point in time how to promote that or to raise that level. And then I can select additional options. It's noticing that I didn't have a DNS server out in the environment, so it's recommending that I install a DNS server on this first domain controller, and that's what my checkbox there is going to be. Also, I have to have a global catalog. We'll talk more about that a little bit later on, but that's kind of like a global index, if you will, of everything that's going on inside of the forest. Now I'll go ahead and click on Next, and here it's going to tell me, a brief interruption, that I have dynamically assigned IP addresses. This is normally not a good idea. Our computers are referenced on the network by IP address, and that's how my clients will find this domain controller to get its domain services for logon and all other kinds of things. Now, what I want to do for almost any type of a server is to use static IP addresses. So I'm going to select this right here, and then notice that it doesn't open up another window for me to statically assign the IP address. And by the way, a static IP address is an address that doesn't change until an administrator manually changes it. But it's a manually configured address that is just that. It's static. It stays the way it is. The alternative there would be a DHCP address, which would be dynamically assigned, and that means that my IP address could change, from one week to the next potentially. It doesn't actually happen very often, but it could happen. And if that address changed, then it would cut off service from this domain controller, and then my clients would not be happy. So what I'll do is to change to a static IP address. Notice where my mouse pointer is. It's on the network connection down here. I can right-click here to choose Network and Sharing Center. Ultimately, this can also be accessed, as you can see in the path up here, through the control panel. Now, once I've gotten here, I want to manage my network connections, and then I'm going to go to my local area connection. And yours might be called local area connection or local area connection 2 or some other numeral thereafter. But I'm just going to go here and go to the properties of this. And then what I'll do is we've got two different versions of IP, IPv6 and IPv4. For our current purposes, I'm just going to disable 6 because we're not going to really necessarily use its capabilities here, and it'll make it easier to assign a static address to version 4. But version 6 is simply a expanded version of IP, which gives me substantially more IP addresses that I could use. And so here I'm going to enter in a static IP address of, how about 10.10.10.70, and a subnet mask. I'll make it a class C subnet mask, and 10.10.10.1 for my default gateway. Now this again is some more material that's outside of our current scope, but this is going to how other computers on the network are going to find me. They're going to find me at 10.10.10.70, and the subnet mask simply identifies whether or not, when I try to find resources on a network, whether it's on my same network or someone else's network, and this kind of acts as a strainer, if you will, or to be able to discriminate between what's on my network and someone else's. If it finds out that what I'm trying to access is on someone else's network, then it will send it to the default gateway, which is normally going to be a router, and the router will then be able to find a way to get the communication to its destination. And then I'll enter in my DNS servers. In this case, it's going to be my own local address, 127.0.0.1. Now, you might say to yourself, well, wait a minute, you typed 10.10.10.70 as yourself up here, your own IP address, so how come you're entering in this down here? Those aren't the same addresses. Well, anything that starts with a 127 is going to be what we call a loopback address, which means that this server will talk to itself, so to speak. So whenever it tries to look up a DNS record, it will talk to itself down here. Now, I could just easily have put 10.10.10.70, but if at a point in the future, if I change that to 71, for example, then this means I won't have to change it down here, and if I leave it at a loopback address, then I never have to mess with that part of it again. So I'll just OK past all of that and close everything up, and then resume my little wizard. So then I'll just go ahead and next through this. This is simply telling me that it didn't find a delegation for the DNS server. This means that, really, I don't have this domain yet. I don't have a nuggetlab.com that exists anywhere in DNS. And if I already had a DNS server that I wanted to serve that zone, or that namespace as we call it, then I would have to be able to create that in DNS. For our purposes, no action is required in our case because I don't already have a DNS server, so I'll continue by clicking on yes. Now here it asks me where I want to put some files. The database folder, in other words, the ntds.dit folder, where it's going to be located here, tells me where to locate that, as well as log files in the sysvol. In our purposes, I'm going to leave them all on the same drive, but you can split those up to different locations to help load balance a little bit. Maybe one hard drive is extremely busy, and you want to put some of this on a different drive somewhere else. And if it's really too busy, you probably need to install additional domain controllers. And when Active Directory first came out in Windows 2000, they recommended that we split up these roles into different drives, different physical drives, not just different partitions. It's okay for our current purposes, and we found out that it's really not too bad to leave them all on the same one. Plus, there's good recoverability nowadays, which we didn't always have. So I'm going to leave them there, click on Next, and then I'm going to enter in a password, if I can remember it. Okay. And what is this password? This is what we use in Directory Services Restore mode, which is a troubleshooting method of booting into Windows Server 2008 that we can use to recover Active Directory if something bad has happened. Then the next thing we'll do here, this is new with Windows Server 2008, is this Export Settings button. Now I can use that to create an answer file, so that the next time maybe I need to install a peer domain controller in my same domain, then rather than going through this whole wizard, next, finish, then I can just go to a command prompt and type dcpromo / unattend, for example, and then colon, and then I'll be able to enter in, let me just show you an example. I might type something like this, dcpromo / unattend, colon, and then my answer file txt or something like that. Okay, so that's what I would do if I wanted to automate this whole process instead of clicking next, finish. By exporting the settings, it would put that answer file in for me. Now, what's going to happen is I'm just going to wait for all of the installations to take place. This will take a few minutes, so I'm going to go offline. I'll pause recording here, and when I come back, we'll actually have rebooted the computer because I'm going to reboot on completion. I'm going to check this box here in just a moment. So next time you hear me recording, we will have had installed our domain controller. Alright then, we've now rebooted the server, and we will be able to administer Active Directory from this point forward would be going to Server Manager, and then going to Roles, and then now you see that we can have Active Directory domain services and our DNS server there, which were both installed as part of DC Promo. As I scroll on down through this and expand out, we see that we have Active Directory users and computers, which includes the nuggetlab.com domain and a number of other containers. First of all, there's the built-in container. This is what's going to have a lot of the security groups that we will be working with. A lot of it's really behind the scenes, but there's some things there that are going to be put in by default. Any computer accounts we had, and of course we don't have any except for the domain controller, which is the computer we're working with right now, and it's named DC Nugget 1. Then we have foreign security principles. This is really not quite part of our current discussion, but this relates to objects from an external domain that we might be able to trust. And when we trust those foreign security principles, we can put them inside of groups in our domain and then grant access to resources, for example. And then here's our users. And you can see here that there's a number of different user accounts available. Also, by the way, you might be looking at this and wondering, well, why do we have users and groups in users and users and groups here in built-in? Well, let's distinguish that just briefly here. These accounts are local only to domain controllers. Since domain controllers replicate the same directory database between themselves, these accounts that you see here will only appear on domain controllers. And then I won't be able to really use them directly anywhere else. So for example, this administrator's security group is the administrator security group for domain controllers. Other computers will also have a local administrator's security group, but it won't be this exact same one. They will be different. They look the same, but they'll actually be different. Whereas these users and groups exist and are available throughout the entire domain. So if I have someone who's a member of domain admins, then that security group is visible and available throughout the entire domain on any member servers in my domain, on other domain controllers, just everywhere. And then briefly, let's take a look at some other things here. Here's Active Directory sites and services. I'm going to expand that out a little bit so you can see a little bit better. And then we can see here we have our sites. Now, I only have one site, and it's just called the default first site name. These other items that we see here are relative to the default first site name. We'll talk more about sites at a future point in time. But again, you can see that I have this single server inside of this site. Again, further configurations coming up later with that, as well as the subnets. And then we'll also talk at length about DNS servers in this particular series. And with this, we see the domain controller, or rather the server that hosts the DNS service. And then we see the forward lookup zone, and the important part of this is nuggetlab.com. Because I have this domain zone that appears here, now anybody in the domain that wants to log on using this domain controller or access any other services or get Kerberos tickets, all of those domain type things will be pointed to this server and be able to access those services because of its registration here. And now then, before I conclude our video, I'm just going to show you the ntds.dit file, and I'm just going to go to the default locations for this, and it's going to be under Windows and then NTDS, and then you can see that there is the ntds.dit file, and the only reason why I'm showing you that in particular is not because we can double click on it or edit it or anything like that, but I only show it to you because I wanted you to be aware of the fact that Active Directory does consist of the contents of that file, but we edit it using other tools such as Active Directory users and computers. Alright, in this particular nugget, we looked at an introduction to Active Directory. And within Active Directory, we asked some questions about what it really is. Remember, it's that one file, but it's also the contents of that file that's important to us. Our sites, our various services that are available, our DNS zones that are replicated in Active Directory, our users, computers, groups, all those sorts of things. And we looked at some advantages of Active Directory as well as the domain structure. Remember, you've heard a lot of terms before probably, like forest, domain, forest root, all these kinds of things, a tree, sites. We looked at those things and explained what those are. And then we concluded with an actual installation of the forest root, or this can also be described as the installation of the first domain in my forest. When I do that, that becomes my forest root. And as I've said before, we have a lot of other topics we'll be talking about throughout this series, so we introduce some technologies here. We'll elaborate them on further on down through the series. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.